Good afternoon, everyone. I'm back with you, and I'm very pleased to be back speaking with Professor Isa Blumi. However, I'm not happy in the sense that Israel has just bombed the southern suburbs of Beirut literally 2 minutes before we began this conversation. They bombed an apartment building in one of the busiest areas in Dache in the south of Beirut. And it's Sunday. It's also allegedly Lebanese Independence Day celebrations, although that's something else we can possibly discuss. And it's also an area which on a Sunday is a busy market area. So at the moment, friends of mine are calling around hospitals to try and ascertain whether their own relatives have survived the strike or not. And Isa, we've had the passing of Trump's resolution. I'm not even going to call it the UN Security Council Resolution 2803, which we know is just a furtherment of the ethnic cleansing and the genocide of Palestinians. And almost as soon as the resolution was passed, the same night, Israel bombed Palestinian refugees in a camp in Sidon in southern Lebanon, targeting teenagers and civilians at a sports field where they were playing football. So for those people who claim that the Russian and the Chinese abstention was in order because, in their opinion, a veto would have then forced the killing to continue. The killing hasn't stopped, and it's not going to stop. So I really want to start with your take on what happened at the UN Security Council and why there was an abstention from the P2, let's say, members of the P5, that had in their hands the possibility of actually stopping this genocidal resolution being passed.
Well, at this stage, we really cannot be surprised by this cooperation. That basically what we have here. It's an exoneration of past crimes, and it provides the kind of cover for continued useless debate. I mean, we end up just spending all the time arguing amongst, I don't know, I don't even know if we're like-minded anymore. I don't know if we've ever been like-minded, but there's a clear continuous separation between those who have capacities to actually do something meaningfully to stop the destruction of human beings across the world, and those who have no other recourse but throughout their lives resist. And those who are resisting have been regularly abandoned. I have finding cases throughout the world, the Cold War, that there have been far more cases of abandonment and betrayal than solidarity, with the exception, of course, of the people who have the least capacity to actually realize, by way of expressing alliance, expressing their solidarity, they can't realize success. They don't have those capacities. They live in communities that are often directly oppressed by their governments, or are living in societies whose states have been plundered for centuries by various mechanisms of wealth extraction. And I think we've become completely incapable in many corners of the privileged Western world, and that extends to the post-industrial world of the former Soviet bloc and elsewhere, to connect the sacrifices that the peoples of the global South have continuously made to, unfortunately, make our lives livable while their lives have to remain of no value. And I mean, their murder today, yesterday, the last 150 years, unfortunately does serve as some kind of ideological project. It does serve as some narrative about how the world needs to function. And in many ways, this complicated fallacy of a world that operates on justice, on international law, that we continuously bring up as somehow it's been betrayed. When has it actually been enforced? My goodness, people, when has it actually ever been a guiding principle to shaping how powerful people interact with the rest of the world? It has not. These are frameworks to continue to obscure, to confuse, to divide. We should no longer subscribe and beg to these institutions. They are created by the ones who have been plundering and murdering and stealing and lying to us for generations. And again, what is the recourse for those who don't have the capacity to operate and create a parallel system, a parallel universe? We can't. That's the fundamental problem. The rules and the contours of our existence is defined by our enemies. So, but we keep making the mistake of trying to operate within those confined. I mean, there are philosophical counter arguments to how we continuously function in our world, but how are you going to apply it? You need power. You don't have power. And the only way we're going to ever get any power, not to misuse it, not to abuse it, not to take the lives and resources of others, but to actually provide some kind of foundation from which we can then permanently survive parallel to this world, this universe that these monsters have created. That's my response, is that it's what were we expecting? What were we really expecting? The war was going on. I mean, Europe is now low on TNT because they've been supplying its primary asset in the region for the last 3 years to devastate, destroy not only the peoples of Gaza, who are refugees, for multiple generations now, but to continue the war on people of South Lebanon, to continue the influence and shaping of the destruction of Syria, of Yemen, of Sudan. And why are we continuously? Well, maybe just by simply we refuse to interact in the confines of your world. We're not going to show up to the UN anymore. We're not going to cooperate with the UNFIL. We're not going to cooperate with any, because you just betray us over and over again. Maybe that's at this stage you just basically have to turn your back and say, you know what, we're going to pursue. The only thing that you clearly respond to is when you're threatened by, and how are we threatening you? Economic sanctions, sure. We can all turn our back into these economic mechanisms. They were clearly shaking a little bit by the fact that people, after 2.5 years, finally got to the streets and shut down the Italian economy for a day or two.
Yeah.
So we actually know what animates responses from empire. They certainly are concerned that actually people go to the streets and organize in much more destructive ways. That gets their attention. But we continuously operate on their terms, which is this international law, spectrum of international law, human rights law. I mean, give it up. We have to give it up. It doesn't exist.
Yeah. And I think almost like having engaged in the arguments really since the passing of the resolution over what Russia and China's reaction should have been, I think to a degree it's because so many people are still clinging to this raft that somehow there's some kind of long game going on, that ultimately, we shouldn't be denigrating members of the anti-imperialist coalition, because a lot of people still perceive Russia and China as being some kind of counter to the Western imperialist Zionist bloc. And I guess I want to talk about this because for me, I think this is a huge stumbling block to people actually understanding what is needed. One, I saw a huge amount of what I consider to be actual racism and Orientalism being expressed by let's say, leftist, Marxist, Leninists, and so on in the West, but also even in the Far East, in the sense that, well, this is an Arab problem. If the PA and the Arab states voted for it, why should Russia and China veto it? So, I mean, I would like to get your take on this. In a sense, I'm running through the arguments that I've been having for the last 2 or 3 days that for me are extremely depressing. I totally get what you're saying. And my point also is that the resistance here, don't expect anyone in Russia or China or in the West or in the UN to help them. That's not the point. No one's looking for any serious military intervention. Economic intervention would be good. Sanctions on Israel would be what one would expect if international law such as it is were really working, right? If the Genocide Convention were really a thing that isn't just adhered to by Yemen. If the Geneva Conventions weren't just a frame in which they can act as they, or within the rules-based governance that they choose to adhere to, right? So that's not the point. Nobody is actually expecting Russia and China to physically expend energy to do anything. The resistance is doing that. All the resistance would like, in an ideal situation, is for them to do something to put the brakes on the genocide, on the economic and military capability of the entity that is murdering them on an hourly, daily basis. But in my opinion, sorry, yeah. So I mean, I'd like to hear your take on that.
But I mean, it's obvious that it's not going to happen. They facilitate, I mean, by sabotaging, undermining, by creating this kind of sense of hope, and that there is some solidarity out there at the institutional level, that functions as as a strategic asset for those who want to realize long-term victory over indigenous people's resistance to globalization, to capitalism. Russia's political elite have been, nurtured over this whole period probably even Brezhnev's period, but certainly during Gorbachev's period, and I mean, who we have emerging after that. I mean, the Communist Party, those who were remaining somewhat operating on principle, were the ones primarily persecuted by Yeltsin and then Putin, right? There's not a resilient echo of Soviet Union in Russia. It's been completely transformed and has been operating in cooperating economically. Its functions in the global economy that has been completely commandeered by the same oligarchs and very powerful interests who have commandeered the PRC. There is no Communist Party that operates and mobilizes the populist possibilities in China itself. I mean, hundreds of millions of people are being exploited economically, to working in horrible conditions and living in increasing conditions of personal debt. And we need to be able to analyze that and make our conclusions. If it's still something that is still, if we still have and carry Marxist kind of critique of global economy, and that clearly is not at play. So then my point is, why are we even bothering trying to convince this audience anymore? I mean, in many ways that empowers them. If we end up kind of spending our resources just consciously trying to enforce some kind of solidarity with people who don't quite understand and don't understand the very basic principles of the critique that we have about imperialism. They're not, well, they're not either, they're duplistic, they're kind of speaking out of two different sides of their mouth, or they just don't understand because, again, they grew up in a very different world than the world that emerged and was shaped by these anti-colonialist movements. And what we're dealing with are people who are resisting in those terms, but those terms have clearly are not echoing anymore. They don't actually reflect in how we look at, analyze the world anymore, at this kind of superstructure of discourse about in 21st century. And yeah, there are people within our societies that we live and love so much that are also, whether knowingly or not, complicit in the shift away from us understanding this as a kind of the no holds bar resistance to criminal activity of an operation that has commandeered states, commandeered international law, has written international laws. These are all instruments of powered interest. We can't continue to work within the confines of this system. And that has been recognized for generations by increasingly smaller and smaller groups of people because of the way we are socialized, the way we understand and interact with the world is mediated by, by social media. And you have contradictory, conflicting interests. I mean, Algeria voted.
I know, I was going to mention
Algeria
that.
voted and sanctioned this. Now, one could understand and perhaps appreciate that that's on one side, they're also very nervous about the actors who supposedly are mobilizing political Islam. They went through a horrible war in the 1990s with some of these actors. But of course, it was Washington who was funding the GIA and who brought down the FLN in Algeria and made Algeria what it is today. And it's certainly a transition for that society, right? They've moved very rapidly away from the revolutionary esprit that existed in the 60s and 70s. And I mean, it won't take much to imagine, I mean, or observe what happened to Syria or Iraq or Yemen and Libya, right? We have whole generations now, Generation X, Y, and Z, who completely have no connection to what their forefathers and mothers and fought for and died for and sacrificed for. So how can we, again, I think it's a losing battle at this stage. We don't have the capacity to transform by way of advocacy through the mediums that we communicate with each other. We don't control the academy. We don't control the media. We don't. So again, I think it really does require that we get off the grid, intellectually speaking, discursively. Stop trying to make the case through the prism of international law, because it's a lost, and then if that means that we rely on the institutions like the UN and countries that participate like Algeria or China and Russia. And when they fail us, then it constitutes a victory. Cannot be the case. It cannot be the case.
Exactly. And this is because the optics is exactly that. It's a victory for the Zionist bloc, right? I mean, Trump has even thanked Russia and China publicly for abstaining.
And there's quid pro quo, right? I mean, there's a whole this Trump's 23 points about Ukraine. Let's just divide up Russia. I mean, let's steal the $300 billion that is now dollars of Russian wealth that's now frozen in Europe, and we'll use that to for no bid contracts to rebuild both Ukraine and the territories that will be annexed by Russia. So I mean,
and also to bail out Israel for reparations in Gaza and to build Jared Kushner's waterfront property to create this is one thing that I wanted to ask your opinion on, because there are multiple reasons, in my opinion, and I've discussed them many times over the last few days, why Russia and China should, what deals might have been done in order for Russia and China to abstain as they did. Because in my opinion, there were deals done. It's very clear to me in Syria, there were deals done. The phone call between Putin and Netanyahu, suddenly there's a military delegation from Russia in Syria, suddenly they're in the south, and then Netanyahu appears in the south speaking to the IOF occupation forces there. So it's very clear. I mean, Israel has lobbied for Russia to stay in Syria from the beginning. They've lobbied the US for Russia's presence for multiple reasons. One, of course, the friendship between Putin and Netanyahu and Israel and Russia, but also to contain Turkey, Erdogan, to prevent him reinforcing Syria on behalf of HTS and bringing in air defense and military capability again into Syria, etc. So there's many reasons that I can think of, or deals that may have been done. Even the Trump peace plan on Ukraine suddenly appeared, I think, 24 hours after the abstention in a leaked article in or breaking article in Politico, right? But we know that Gaza, the intention for Israel and the Gulf states, the GCC, and Washington is for Gaza to be basically cleansed of any resistance. Those Palestinians that remain can end up in even smaller concentration camps where they will be helpful as slave labor for the industrial areas that are going to be built inside Gaza using Palestinian gas to fuel those industrial areas, turn it into a luxury free trade zone, Dubaify it. And then, of course, it becomes an essential component in the India-Middle East economic corridor. That's where I'm stumbling a little bit to understand, are Russia and China not seeing that that's the eventual outcome, which has, I guess, the threat of derailing or at least putting an obstacle in the way of China's Belt and Road Initiative? Or are they going to switch to using Syrian territory because now China has also normalized the Jolani government and they're talking about economic reconstruction involvement, and Jolani is going to send back all the Uyghur terrorists that, of course, the Syrian army died fighting against for the last 14, 15 years. So I'd like to get your opinion on that. Like, what is the benefit to Russia and China for what they did? And what is the potential downside to what they did? Also from a reputational perspective.
Well, again, we need to think again how the political economy of modern or contemporary states, how that works. The vast majority of the people of Russia and China are not represented by the political class, the technocrats who spin these deals, who are, whether or not there's even actual debates about will beneficiaries of Russia's economy, which are very limited people, I mean, quite literally, you can probably count them on two hands, right? In terms of the real concentration of wealth and how it accumulates. I mean, this political class seems to have very little concern over the livelihood of the rapidly shrinking population of Russia, right? We've known for decades now that the Russians have suffered tremendously from the transition from the Soviet Union to a partner or a piece or component of the global economy. Its assets have been availed. Much of the privatization process has been mediated by, institutions based in the Washington, consensus group, and financed by international capital. And the way manpower is abused, whether it be these well-trained men who end up, serving as mercenaries to protect natural resource assets in Africa, going back to the early 2000s, to fighting, just being pieces of human flesh to be destroyed in a very profitable war, which entails, of course, new armaments, new tactics used for counterinsurgencies. I mean, these are the bloodletting in Ukraine is about, of course, natural resources, about the potential for mining. That's no concern whatsoever for the people who once lived in mixed communities, right? Now it's now a very neat delineation. You don't need people living in these areas of plunder, of natural resource plunder. This is, I think, one way we have to understand and appreciate what is behind this whole murderous transformation. States don't care for their populations. They don't represent their populations. Populations in China, in Russia, in the United States, in Germany are, if you actually held a poll and you gave them access to the information about just what is actually happening in their so-called name, they would vomit. They would be disgusted. They would rise up. If you gave them the possibility, would you choose to continue living in this condition or change the world for a better? I'm pretty sure that most people would still take the option and change the world for better, which would mean the elimination of these oligarchs, the elimination of the system that has emerged over the course of the 20th century. So we have to start there, I think. So those people who are benefiting from this artificial binary that works in the way we talk about world affairs today are more than happy to continue with this discourse about multipolarity, about them, and that somehow it gives them the opportunity to actually position what they functionally are doing, which is partnering in genocide. Chinese companies are running Israeli ports.
Yeah.
We have more opportunities.
And energy now. They've invested in energy.
To make money with war. This is the condition that we know from already the beginning of the 20th century, probably earlier, that war is a huge factor to transferring wealth from workers, from people who could have stopped this plunder of world resources and the destruction of coherent communities at the beginning of the 20th century. There's no reason why over the course of the 19th and 20th century we had to go in this direction. It was not guaranteed, but it was one that were strategies of disaggregation, of pitting brothers and sisters against each other in these horrible wars where nationalism comes into play. I mean, we still operate on terms as if somehow nationalism is a driving force and accounting for why people would embrace their political technocratic elites. Why would people in China who are living under horribly polluted, exploitative conditions subscribe to this larger idea that somehow they're benefiting from these oligarchs' business in Palestine? They're not benefiting from it. Now, we have, of course, a whole range of tools to complicate the system and account for what's going on. And you've noted racism is a primary function of that, to rationalize. If we run out of arguments to justify this on other grounds, then we're going to resort to the more basic ones. It's in their nature to kill each other. What can we do? I can't do anything here.
Yeah.
We tried to develop you. We tried to modernize you. I remember having a debate which you helped curate. There was my interlocutor at some points. Well, China is there to modernize and civilize the Turkic peoples of Western China. That's the role of modern day contemporary China. And that, again, echoes and reflects a lack of appreciation for what previous generations criticized, how they criticized imperialist capitalism. And China and Russia represent a spearhead of capitalist imperialism, finance capitalist imperialism. The
Mm.
ruling elites of those societies are not working on the behalf of the working classes in their own countries, and certainly are not there to operate and defend the interests of the indigenous peoples around the world. And that's, I think, a fundamental important change in how we talk about things, is to stop talking in those terms, that somehow we have states that are members and participants in a global system are operating on terms that are antagonistic and are trying to somehow pursue a campaign of subterfuge to undermine this international system. That's clearly not the case.
Mm.
Um,
You're raising more questions in my mind now.
right.
Um,
Again,
I guess,
I resort back to my constant. What alerted me was, why allow what happened to Yemen? I mean, both
yeah.
Russia and for 15 years have looked the
Mm.
other way and have exploited this. They've been
Yeah.
plundering Yemen's natural resources, like in
Yeah.
many other conflict zones around the world. So
Sudan. I mean,
Sudan,
China's involvement
DRC,
in Sudan.
DRC,
Um,
Angola. I
yeah.
mean, throughout the Sahel, we don't have a state that has the capacity to actually represent and defend. I mean, again, Burkina Faso, what's happening in the Sahel? It's a remarkable story that,
Yeah.
but even there, they are fixed on, we operate on at the state level. We have to operate
Mm-mm.
along kind of alliances, and that allows for an infiltration of these, I think, very legitimate indigenous, locally nurtured
Yeah.
resistance to how the world functions. We're allowing too much of those to infiltrate and to confuse us, to make us incapable of actually coming up with new strategies that avoids being co-opted and steered away and confused. And I can't speak on behalf of anyone in South Lebanon. Again, it's not up to me. Uh,
Mm.
uh, I got gray hairs and I've done things in my life, but I can't do it anymore. And I certainly don't have the capacity to interact with people. I wouldn't want to trust anyone like me coming in the outside and saying, you got to do this and that and that. Screw you, Isa. But at some point, I can sit back and see that, there's been a fundamental mistake of letting up to somehow giving one more chance to the international community to have outsiders stand up in solidarity behind us.
Mm.
I'm in Bilbao right now, and it's an amazing thing to be in a city in a region that 90% of the population understand how screwed up the relationship that the world has with the peoples of Palestine. But
Mm.
in the end, there's still Israeli tourists here. There's still American tourists here. There's still Russian tourists here.
Mm.
There's still Chinese tourists here. And so again, to what extent does our solidarity, make us change our relationship with the world? And it hasn't, even in places like the Basque country, where in
Yeah.
Europe is really one of the only, real
Yeah. Yeah.
collective concentrated zones of solidarity with people of Palestine. But that doesn't translate. I mean, they still have tourists coming all over the world, having their fun time. It's basically people are out in the streets till 4 a.m, drinking away and making money for some of those people who are making money in plundering the Middle East.
Yeah. The same with, how many people benefit from the modernization in the UAE, the gold trade through the UAE, of course, which is one of China's main benefits alongside its trade partnership with the UAE, because that's also what I always try to point out. It's not only the backdoor dealings with Israel. I mean, they just Chinese state companies just established a new deal supplying energy, working with Dalia, the Israeli energy giant. But it's also working with the Zionist bloc, with Saudi Arabia, UAE. When people talk about, well, the Arab states, voted for the resolution? Like, what Arab states are you talking about? I mean, me personally, and I'm like you, I don't impose my opinions on the people here because it's not my place to do that. My place is only to transmit their messages and to speak about the situation on the ground and to talk about the history with people like you who can educate people on the more contextual background to what is happening. And that for me is extremely important because, like you said, younger generations are forgetting it all. They're forgetting even to a large degree what empire means. They're so drunk on AI and technology and so on that the fact that indigenous peoples even exist and that their cultures, their heritage and their history, their entire civilization of 10,000 years plus is slowly or quickly, in the case of Syria right now, being eradicated. Syrian history is now being rewritten. Literally, in the last year, it's being rewritten. Historic sites are being destroyed. Commemorative days are being cancelled. This is what is happening, and what I'm afraid of in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, even less, all that history is going to be forgotten because there won't be people like you to teach it. There'll be a whole new raft of academics who are brought up in a system where this history and this civilization and this culture and these indigenous peoples don't exist. And that's terrifying for me. That's not a world I want to live in. So I guess, sorry, I went off on a tangent there. I guess what I want to ask, because I'm curious, the competition, how Russia and China are perceived as being some kind of counter to Western imperialism. We've talked about the fact that do governments even really exist anymore in the sense of a centralized structure which represents the people of that country? I don't think so. I think that's been dead for a long time now. I think now, as you pointed out in Russia, the country is governed by the transnational ruling elites, the oligarchs, the people who benefit at the very top of the food chain. And humanity itself is becoming less and less important, other than as slave labor, as a functionary to sustain the higher up the food chain complex cluster, let's say. I've been watching Kirill Dmitriev, who's one of the closest people to Putin, both from a familial perspective, but also from an advisory perspective. This is a guy, I mean, if this were someone from the West, right, people would be throwing their hands up in horror. No one's saying a word. This guy was literally Stanford, Harvard educated. He was born in Ukraine. He's rubbed shoulders with WAF, Eric Prince. He pushed through the COVID vaccine, so on and so forth. So this is a guy who's completely enmeshed in this oligarch complex, who's now representing Putin in the States. He's the Steve Witkoff of Russia. And what I see from his statements is a looming war against the EU with Russia and the US actually coming together on this war. And I'd be interested, because what I'm interested in is to what extent are Russia and China in competition with the US? Is it only from an economic trade perspective? And so therefore, where their interests overlap, there's going to be collaboration. Are they fused into the American economic capitalist system to an extent where they're never going to be able to extricate themselves?
If we can use a different set of analogies, think about what
Sure.
cartels do.
Yeah.
Just think about how corporations function. Often they work seemingly at competition with each other, but they always come to agreements about how we're going to strategically, over the next 10 years, work together to assure that there'll be no outliers, that there will not be any competition, that we can actually consolidate our ability to dominate and create new arenas for economic for wealth production and reallocation of resources to service our interests. So certainly that plays itself out with the whole energy arena, right? We know that they're not sabotaging each other. I mean, even the Nord Stream bombing, all that, it was it functioned in reifying a discourse that required Europeans, I mean, to talk to colleagues in Sweden about Russia. I mean, they are completely indoctrinated, and they completely buy this line that they are in an existential, they're almost going to have to fight a war in
I
order
did
to
a lecture
survive.
once at Uppsala University. It was a disaster, to be honest.
And one scratches your head, and of course you realize and appreciate that there's so much value added to a population who are completely misdirected to dedicate their understanding of the world on terms that are determined by outsiders, or by NATO or whatever. I don't see that the ruling elites of Europe have any kind of fundamental fear of Russia. I think they're part of a narrative that has cooked a new way of accounting for why we have to live the way we are going to live soon. Why do
Right.
we have significant austerity? Why are Europeans experiencing significant inflation? And why are they losing certain services? Oh, we have to dedicate more and more money to fighting Russia. Yeah, I mean, if you just look at it from a little bit of a distance, it makes perfect sense what they're doing. They've been doing it in the past. And I can fully understand and see that Europeans are a huge liability. That there is still some kind of political narrative that is required to somehow shore up an increasingly aging population who are demanding certain services, right? And that we have already had politicians, whether it's in the UK, whether it's in the context of a Davos agreement, we actually can't afford to live like we used to. We're all going to have to live in 15-minute cities. We're going to be counting your CO2 emissions, and you're not going to be able to travel. So these are we're being alerted that we're going to live. I mean, my child is going to live in a horribly different world with very limited kind of opportunities to experience that world. And not to say that, we have lived on the dime of others, people's suffering around the world. I appreciate that. And that's something that I found fundamentally, that there are other ways for us to interact in the world where we don't have to plunder the world's natural resources. We can make sure that people's livelihoods are better and everywhere else in the world. Obviously, that we can't do that when we have an oligarchy who wants to concentrate power more and more. I mean, literally, we have 2,000 billionaire, trillionaire, or whatever they're called. I don't know, billionaires. Yeah, it's a huge shift of capacity and how and where people's labors are being used as surplus to fund and subsidize the concentration of power that now means you're probably right. Europeans are going to face another intercontinental war where there's going to be a lot of bloodletting. There already has been horrible bloodletting in Eurasia, right?
Yeah.
If you think about from the early 90s onwards, from Chechnya to the Ukraine, obviously, to, of course,
Yugoslavia.
Yugoslavia, Middle East, there's been just bloodletting left and right, mobilizing different accountings for why these wars happen: political Islam, sectarianism, inter-ethnic conflict that goes back to ancient times, and we will have new iterations of such rhetorical tactics. And I have no doubt in my mind that as a continent, Europeans' lives are going to the direction of what happened to the peoples of East Europe, where they saw a significant break of that social security net, of the ability to find a reasonable life. I mean, that you go to these cities, Prague, or they look like they've done fairly well, but if you actually go to the countryside and you actually look at the structure of these societies, they've been completely reorientated, and there is no functioning Czech Republic, Slovakia anymore, as it maybe once was in the Habsburg Empire, certainly not during the course of the 20th century. And I don't see any reason why they don't resort to actually, as they're saying, French people are going to have to sacrifice. We're going to have to sacrifice our sons. I don't know if you heard that from top generals. They're literally in Germany saying, we're going to stick 18-year-olds and going to start training them again. And for what purposes?
Yeah, we're heading to conscription across the EU and the UK.
Yeah.
I mean, and even in the US, the Charlie Kirk assassination is literally being used as a recruitment tool.
I mean, you're literally having, with this ICE activities in North America, you're literally having people being tortured to death in dungeons with no consequences. Now, all we have to do is unleash a kind of, intersectarian war, or a war between people who are MAGA supporters and those who are the pathetic left wing. I mean, you can see that kind of discourse ratcheting up hatred toward each other. You saw that in COVID already. Send those people to concentration camps. They should be hung because they weren't taking their shots. That's so easy to manipulate. And we saw that manifesting in some interesting ways, and I'm not entirely settled on if it kind of got out of hand, this whole rising fury at Israel, and by extension, Jews, quote unquote Jews, which that could be, a pretext for an entirely different kind of, policing of content and the new tool sets.
Oh, for sure, yes.
To isolate people, to undermine your ability to engage in debate in our societies. But I see no reason why we're not going to end up killing each other in the next 20 years. The way that class of political leaders who came out of nowhere, they were all students of kind of like these Davos workshops, right? They were all Davos workshops.
WF, yeah.
And they ended up in Finland, in Estonia, in Sweden, and they've been in just their types. They all look the same. They're all high on cocaine. They're all high on power. They all have some kind of very dubious backgrounds that make them completely vulnerable to manipulation. And they're taking their societies to a zone of an arena of conflict that whether or not we collectively at some point we're not going to have a choice, because if we do raise our voices, they have the capacities to shut us down, to isolate us completely. There are people being cut off from their money. There are people who literally don't have access to bank accounts. Sorry, it looks like you got frozen. There is the ICC. There's the ICC judge in France who cannot travel. He cannot use a credit card. He cannot use a bank card. I don't know if you heard this story. So it's increasingly getting to the point where they have a capacity to actually undermine anyone's freedom of movement, undermine anybody's ability to actually communicate to the outside world. And that's largely because we've surrendered our communities. We've surrendered how we used to function. Not too long ago. I mean, I'm old enough. I'm pretty sure you're old enough to remember how we used
to
engage with each other. We didn't have cell phones. We didn't have internet. And we have to go back to that. We literally have to go back. As we said this before, we have to figure out now to find and collectively
ways to,
and collectively, if we create enough of these self-sustaining communities, we can actually find ways to work together, as we did in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s.
Yeah, I mean, there's a very good French comedian from the Cameroons. I don't know if you know him, Dieudonné.
How he's been persecuted and hounded for
exactly.
Decades,
But I met him back in 2014 during the Zionist aggression against Gaza then, and I did a couple of shows with him. But he was he was a real pioneer.
Absolutely.
Because he was talking about, and it's exactly what you're saying, to disconnect from the system and create a parallel system that you can survive within. I mean, I think at that point he'd already established an insurance company, and this is why they persecuted him to this extent, right? And it's I compare it to what Hezbollah, of course, is doing here. They have a complete non-usury banking system where, and I keep talking about this, you know, where people take their gold, they deposit the gold, they get given the value of the gold, and they make payments over a chosen period of time, and then they go and collect their gold. There's no interest. Right. And of course, that's the first thing that they're targeting here. Tom Barrack, the economic hitman, all of them are targeting here to try and get it all shut down. Because, of course, it's not only Shia Muslims who are using this banking system, it's open to everyone in Lebanon. I have Christian friends that use it, I have Sunni friends that use it, and so on. And this is anathema to this oligarch complex that is basically trying to control everything in the world today to funnel everything up to their coffers, right? And I, you know, what he was doing was creating this insurance company, which was completely to the side of all the established Zionist run insurance companies like AXA and so on in France. And this is entirely why they started shutting him down back then. You know, and plus he was yeah, and he was comedically protesting. He was fantastic. Of course, you know, he was anti-Semitic and so on, all the rest of the nonsense. But he was comedically challenging the hierarchy of Jewish suffering, which of course is a big deal, because we're all in the UK and London talk about erasing history. They're building a new Holocaust memorial, and in order to do so, they're taking down, for example, a statue of the suffragette movement, right? And this is a few hundred meters from the Imperial War Museum that already has a Holocaust memorial section. So this, it's not only happening here. It's not only happening in West Asia. It's happening everywhere where these people get involved from a military perspective and a perspective of fracturing societies, communities, countries, redrawing the borders to effectively serve their economic interests in the future, right? I want to know what you think about Iran in all this, because we've sort of, you know, for me, I see a very divided Iran. They are a member of BRICS. Venezuela, of course, has been very much excluded from BRICS and is currently in the crosshairs also because it represents very much that resistance perspective. It's an outlier, as you describe them, right? So it needs to be brought to heel. And of course, the fall of Venezuela would then effectively mean that all of Latin America would pretty much then crumble as regards any kind of resistance to what's coming in, the new world order. So I'd be interested, just maybe as a final thought, how you perceive one, Iran in the near and long term, Yemen, because in my opinion, we're seeing now the amplification of the narrative surrounding Sudan, Mali, Eritrea, Nigeria. And of course, many of these countries are in the Horn of Africa, which is facing Yemen. So in my opinion, there is also a project now to bring Yemen to heel, because of course that's been failed by endless invaders and oppressors and occupiers and colonialists. So just finally, maybe to get your views on both countries.
Well, as we've spoken before, I'm not very confident that the revolution has much staying power in Iran with the political class that have made their way and established themselves at the expense of an older generation who have incrementally been killed off, marginalized, retired, quite literally retired, physically removed from their positions of power. And this long-standing element within Iran society who wants to continue to do business and have done fairly well at the personal, individual, and maybe collective level of this period of sanctions. And Iran has not been isolated. Its resources have been availed to global markets, but at significant reduction, right? And savings for the consumers of their oil and other things. And they've become, in many ways, forced to become entirely reliant on channels of commerce that, again, have been very profitable. Brilliant people who have continued to thrive at universities, many of people who have just ended up going and servicing, they go move to Europe and, they've taken their PhDs with them and bring their skill set through service industries in Europe or in North America. That's brain drain is a common problem that Iran as a collective can only best, I think, resist this by going in two directions. One being principled and holding on to the ideals of the revolution, remembering that damn history, which is increasingly difficult. I mean, you're literally seeing these people in power now erecting, old Persian mythology, statues of Persian mythology, which tells us that they've also abandoned the revolution in that regard. That this is a revolution for all of humanity. That we're not going to embrace this chauvinism that the Pahlavi family and had curated for generations. So I'm afraid Iran is rapidly removing itself from these theaters of contention where they had leverage in Syria. And I think because the political and economic class that is going to be the beneficiaries and have been the beneficiaries for a while now are now branching out and availing Iran and will literally make a financial killing from this transition that's happening. I've said it on your show several times recently. There have been indications that there are quiet conversations going on between circuits of power in the Atlantic world and those who are trying to secure and steer Iran away from the revolution, and to the detriment of, again, the region really could have benefited from a revolutionary spree coming from a country that had capacity to pursue that. But it's hard to convince tens of millions of people that they have to endure and pay the, unappreciated costs of standing up on behalf of the rest of the world. Which is the role now is, and that burden's now on the shoulders of much more incapacitated peoples like those in North Yemen or South Lebanon and Burkina Faso, for goodness sake. And in regards to Yemen, there's definitely a rehabilitation, if you will, of capacity. Both UAE and Saudi Arabia, as has been now demonstrated by, I think, 2 or 3 years now, that these are all balloons popped up, inflated with huge liabilities in terms of debt. They are not going to do well moving forward, especially when we're going to start seeing with the financial shenanigans of the AI bubble that's going to blow up in a lot of people's faces. We see Bitcoin has gone collapsed prices, which is destroyed those who came in late into this process. The Japanese carrier trade of the Japanese yen seems to be moving, and there's going to be a lot of movement of money now as people are scrapping to financially survive, which is a new adjustment, a readjustment, a more concentration of power upwards. And the Neom project collapsing finally. We knew that from the very beginning, that that was not feasible, that there was just a way of marketing a transition for Salman bin Salman to survive his internal political conflicts with family members and rival
Yeah.
families. UAE is, again, it's an auxiliary force. It's not operating independent of Washington or of this larger entity, and it will do the bidding and serve the financial interests. And at this stage, it's a continued attempt to secure some relevance in arenas where the victor, in the case of Yemen, in the case of Horn of Africa, is sustainability over the long term. It is becoming more and more necessary as a kind of a standout, if you will, who will survive the transition. As I've long said, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and UAE are not going to be there collectively in the next 20 years. That one or two of these families are going away, and we're going to see a disaggregation of their assets. Now, who's going to be the kind of dominant player in that region on behalf of this transition to this new world order is still to be determined. It is not something
Right.
where all three can share a place
Yeah.
as the role in recirculating all those resources, all that money that circulates around oil and gas, and harboring the ideological responsibility of representing the Arab world. I mean, that we're literally hearing and watching when this meeting in Washington, D.C., a completely inflated narrative that somehow Mohammed bin Salman rehabilitated,
Yes.
protected by Trump. Those bad things happen. Oh, and he has $1 trillion he's now going to spend on the environment. Well, there's no $1 trillion, people. I mean, come on. But I'm reading
Exactly.
Financial Times, sitting there in the airport, reading Financial Times, and you can just see what their function that um, these media that covers business and finance is to inflate a narrative that clearly, if anybody's in the know, this is not how it works. And Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia is in terrible financial position. They don't have the means to actually reallocate $1 trillion from either its sovereign wealth fund or by selling Aramco's assets. They've been doing that for the last couple of years, by the way. This is a make or break moment, and Yemen is one of those areas that desperation is once again like 2014, 2015, or 2010 or 11. And you can see these assets that are in the think tanks. These Yemenis who are in Washington, who are in Brussels, they are ratcheting up again. They've kind of recalibrated. They have a new line to make a kind of an account or justification for what comes next. And for me, Ansala, you read their media, they're also, they're kind of issuing the warning that you guys, we will take out your assets. We will undermine your economies. They too have been ratcheting up and kind of alerting us that everyone's on edge now. And what is going to initiate violence, there's every day there's violence in Yemen on Yemenis, but what's going to initiate this scramble? And we have to appreciate this as we analyze what comes next, that Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, their ruling families, and those kind of economic assets that are working and operating within their spheres of influence, they are rivals to each other. They are not aligned. Now, they collectively still serve the function of assets of empire, this abstraction called empire. As does the Bush family, as does Bain and Company, as does Trump, who's, again, very much a face to something else, right? I mean, this guy is all kind of vulnerabilities from his connections to, as has been exposed, some of these representatives from Georgia. I think she quit the party 2 days ago.
Yes, Marjorie Greene.
Right, yeah. These kinds of defections and these tensions within a system that where people still are operating on the assumption that certain principles stand. People are confused. And again, there people, especially in the populist base of what Trump represented, supposedly, were very, very upset. And those series of events that has happened over the course of the end, last phase before Trump's peace plan, quote unquote, right? We talked about this last time. It's not a peace plan. It is a capitulation. It is an insertion of an end game that had to happen for reasons that we already speculated on. So I think, unfortunately, Yemen is still an outlier that is continuously creating contingencies that need to be responded to. And they're reflected in tensions between neighbors in this arena of imperialist strategy. There is tension between Saudi Arabia and UAE over Sudan. There is tension between Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE over Yemen, and other. I mean, Syria, right? I mean,
definitely.
They're not on board. They're not on board.
Yeah.
And why they're not on board? What is it they are conflicted interest trying? What do they envision is the solution to those conflicts? It is not that they can share the spoils. There are no spoils for them to share.
And even Saudi in Lebanon, it's pushing for influence here.
Right. And
so yeah.
I mean, removing Hezbollah or Ansarallah, and who can actually take the responsibility of doing that, I think would play an important role for the survivability of certain circuits of power who are in conflict amongst themselves, but in the larger corporation of what is empire, it doesn't really matter because it services in the end their enterprise. However, if you preempt, if you actually take initiative, and I mean, I don't know if you saw this for your audience, the United States Marine Corps wrote a report in response to their failures of the U.S. military in their latest venture against Ansarallah. And they said, these guys have become so innovative that it has rendered the U.S. military incapable of actually creating results that the politicians want in Washington, that we have to now adapt new kinds of strategies and learn from what they have done. Now, to me, that's one, remarkable. And of course, that's always the case if you actually have the kind of conditions and the collective will, you will be able to defeat even the United States military. But that means they're now putting in their resources to actually find a way to get rid of this element that they've clearly acknowledged they cannot get rid of. And they're going to just use, like they're going to use European working class people for the last 150 years. They're going to be the cannon fodder. The ones who are going to be expected to do the heavy lifting moving forward, it will be yet again these factions representing the interest of the UAE versus Saudi Arabia versus Qatar. They're going to be Sudanese soldiers or Colombians or others.
ISIS, do you think they'll? I mean, they have been sending ISIS into the south anyway, with Jolani now, supposedly opposed.
Maybe it'll be Uyghurs who are in Syria. They'll be flown into Yemen.
And the Chechens.
And whoever else.
Yeah, no. The foreign takfiri, basically, because this has been a bone of contention, allegedly. Although, of course, they're being used also against Lebanon and against the Alawites, against the Druze, against the Christians, against the Sunni moderates that remain in Syria.
Well, we know that Syrians or whoever is part of the Jolani club who are working and getting paid by that operation, they're going to be used against Hezbollah, right? They're going to be,
of course, yeah.
I mean, they're the first.
And Iraq and against the PMF and Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq also. That's another coming.
Before Turkish soldiers or more Israeli soldiers do that kind of operation, ground operation, the first Syrians and those associated with Jolani who are going to be the ones sacrificed. And that's the
Mm.
same will be applied to the Horn of Africa, and Yemen is going to unfortunately
Yeah.
see a wave of human mercenaries coming mostly
Mm.
from these dislocations that are happening throughout East Africa, Northeast
Mm.
Africa, and in the end, uh, people of Lebanon, of Syria, of Yemen have to survive this. I mean,
Mm.
there's not going to be any help coming from the United Nations.
Anywhere else? No, of course not.
The
No.
United Nations will rubber stamp these operations like they did in Yemen, like they do in
Mm.
Syria, like they've done in Gaza. They're going to rubber stamp
Mm.
all of this. And they're going to
Mm.
even offer troops to, to continue to facilitate and police this. Just like
Yeah. Just like UNIFIL in the south here in Lebanon.
Dieudonné really did it well. You have to get out of the
Yeah.
regulatory spectrum. You have to stop
Mm.
playing by their rules. We have to not operate under regulation of
Mm.
others' rules and principles. We have multiple millennia of values and ethics that have been decimated by the so-called Enlightenment and its progress towards capitalism in its current iteration,
Modernity. Yeah.
modernity. And I'm not a social conservative by any means. I'm a product of the world that I grew up in. And I don't know
Mm.
if I could subscribe to that myself. I don't know how to survive in a farm. But I can see that for humanity, we're going to have to learn those skills again. I,
Mm.
I, I would like to see those who follow me to actually um, find happiness again, being in nature, happiness being with family, happiness again,
Mm.
not having a damn phone in their eyes, so that, at 1 o'clock at
Having
night,
dinner without being on the phone every
having
five
dinner
minutes.
with it's fresh food with no chemicals in it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, yes, I totally agree with you. And even speaking to people here, the fear isn't the war itself. The fear is if they lose and the kind of world that we're going to have to live in or be forced to live in. So, yeah, I mean, I'm totally with you on that. I think we have to start building worlds aside to the world that is incoming to a large degree rather than being. And that also means psychologically not being subsumed by it because it's very difficult when you're working on social media. As you said, that also is a totally infiltrated medium where someone actually said to me last night, and someone is a very strong character, but she said, I end up thinking, am I the one that's insane? Because you're holding on to those principles and that integrity and that belief and that there should be some kind of moral code governing this world. And I think finding communities where, yes, these values are sustained is incredibly important. Isa, thank you again once more. And I know we'll talk again very soon. I wish you all the best, especially with your kid. I know that you're going to be giving them the values. And I know that, you as a professor, we need more people like you because academia is also under attack with the same level of infiltration as we've talked about before. So thank you for everything that you do to maintain the values of resistance and humanity, really. I don't know how else to put it. You're a very important component in the much greater war that we're all facing, I think. So thank you, and thank you for always coming on and being so open with your views, and hope to speak to you again very soon.
Well, thank you for having me on board, and my best to you, Vanessa, and to your audience. And just one last thing: we need to know our enemy, and
Mm,
we seem not to quite understand who our enemy is, and that's for me the last thing that I could possibly do, as you say, a professor or as a father or whatever, is to at least get us
mm.
to think in ways that we know who our enemy is, and It's not us. It's not you and me. We're not enemies. We're not enemies with. We all
very
share
important.
something in common.
That's very important.
Thank you, Vanessa.
Thank you, Isa. Take care.